Now we will turn our time and attention over to our speaker and our guest for this afternoon, Dr. Andrew Root, or as I like to call him, Andy. Dr. Root is the Carrie Olson Baalson Professor of Youth and Family at Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. He's most recently the author of the 3-volume Ministry in a Secular Age series, which includes faith formation in the secular age, what we'll be talking about this evening, the pastor in a secular age, next Tuesday's conversation, and then the congregation in a secular age. Andy has worked in congregations, parachurch ministries, and social service programs, both in the upper Midwest and on the West Coast of the US. He has traveled extensively across the globe and is now joining us from St. Paul from his basement following fulfilling his civic duty because he completed jury duty this afternoon. So thanks, Andy, for doing that. But greetings, Andy, and thanks for being with us this afternoon.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be with you. So we're going to do that odd transition of me switching my camera view and then sharing my screen, and then we'll jump into our presentation for tonight. So it is great to be with you all. Thanks for having me, and Kendall, thanks for inviting me to do this, and all of you who are wherever you're at, whatever you're doing, multitasking in whatever way you are, feel free to do that. But hopefully we can dive into these ideas a little bit. And so what I want to really explore with you is a big why question. And this could actually be 2 why questions that I think are quite relevant for those of us who find ourselves in ministry, either as lay leaders or the ordained pastor or the youth worker, whoever we might be. I think these why questions are pretty significant. And so I think one of the why questions that I want us to unpack this evening is, why does it just feel so hard to be in ministry right now? I mean, why does it feel so hard maybe to be a pastor, in whatever broad way we define what it means to be in pastoral ministry? Why does that feel so hard? And I think we're all smart enough people that we can hold 2 why questions together. And so maybe another nuanced kind of why question here we could get into is why are people leaving the church? It feels like that's a deep felt need. Why are people particularly leaving mainline churches? So I'm just going to answer this question right off the bat. And the reason I think it feels so hard to be a pastor right now, and the reason maybe people are leaving the church, is because of the secular. So there you go. There's your answer. Congratulations. We've finished our lecture tonight. You can now go watch reruns of The Office or something. Of course, I do think that's the answer, that this is difficult because of the secular. And I think maybe people are leaving because also of the secular. But here's the problem, is that the secular is it's a really complicated word. It's hard to get your arms or your mind around what we mean by the secular. If I was braver Zoom-wise, I would have you all list in the chat right now your definition of the secular, but I cannot do 2 things at once, and like talking and looking at chat at the same time is not something that I can pull off. So I'm not going to do that. But my assumption is that if I did ask you to put in your definition of the 50 of you that are on here right now, that there would be some overlap. There'd be a great deal of overlap of your definition with everyone else of what the secular is. But the more we looked at it, I think there'd also be a lot of divergent perspectives. So when one of us says the secular is an issue, or my church is facing the secular, or the Pacific Northwest is a secular place, we understand what we're saying, but I think there's also slippage. We're not really sure, what do we really mean by this word? It's a complicated word, or we could say it's a multivalent word. So because it's a multivalent word, I want us to unfold it a little bit and look at what elements of the secular, what we really mean by the secular. And I have to warn you just up front, with this first presentation this week, I think we're going to get to some solutions and some practical kind of elements of this, especially as we get into the Q&A. But really, my objective here tonight is just to give you the conditions that we're in, that we can keep this conversation going for another 2 weeks. So let's think about what we mean by the secular. Now, I want you to think about this as we unfold this word. I want you to think about it historically, but I want you to think about it more than just historically. I want you to think about the way certain historical realities kind of get embedded in our consciousness, or embedded better in our imagination, and how this kind of frames our imagination. And as we're going to see, as we look at these different ways of thinking about the secular, that once one of these arrives, both historically and then gets embedded in our imagination, it kind of stays with us. It's with us even as we move on. So let's get into a time machine, if you will. And I don't think Zoom has that little app connected to Zoom yet, but it would be pretty cool if they had a time machine piece. But let's enter into our imaginary time machine and go back. Let's just go back 500, 600, maybe 700 years. And if we were to be in the Western world, so let's say we're on the continent of Europe, we would really enter into a time where the dial of the secular was set at 0. I mean, this is hard for us to get our imaginations around, but if we were to go back 500, 600, 700 years ago, would really be in a society where there was no such thing as the secular. Now, clearly people even 500 or 600 years ago had a sense that there were profane things and there were sacred things. And don't think of that pejoratively, like profane means bad. Just think of some things were used in a holy exercise or a holy practice and some other things weren't. So people all had a sense that the chalice that the priest gave the Eucharist in was a holy, sacred thing, and that the shovel that the farmer used was a profane thing. Not bad, but not used in a holy exercise. But for the most part, these things all fit together. These things fit together almost like a puzzle piece. And for the most part, there just wasn't such a thing as the secular. No one really had a secular mindset to such an extent that it was hard not to believe in these societies, that everyone for the most part believed. It was hard to find an atheist. As a matter of fact, I don't know if you know this person in this statue. You probably don't. You'd have to be a major kind of Renaissance history nerd to know this. But I actually saw this statue that's in Venice, Italy, because we did this really cool trip with young people where we took them to walk the steps of Galileo for a grant we had on faith and science. And we brought along this University of Wisconsin historian of science named Mike Shank. And he's spoke 4-5 languages and knew everything about Italy and just European kind of scientific history. He's the kind of guy who was just so generous, but also made you feel like you hadn't done anything with your life because he was so well accomplished. But I got the privilege of dropping him off at this monastery he was going to stay at in Venice for a few days to study. And we dropped off his bags. He said, "Hey, I got to show you this statue." And so he takes me around a corner, down a canal, and there's this statue. And he says, "Do you know who this person is?" I said, "No idea." He said, "Well, this is actually a statue of Paolo Sarpi." I don't know if any of you know who Paolo Sarpi is, but Paolo Sarpi was Galileo's friend, which is why he was showing me the statue. And he was the one who actually encouraged Galileo to publish his book. And then he says, "I got to read this plaque to you." And so the plaque under the statue, which if you were to go today, you could have someone read it to you. It's in Italian. So you'd have to have, some attractive Italian man translate it for you, but it would say Paolo Sarpi's name with the date of his birth and the date of his death, obviously. And then it would have a quote, and it's in Italian. And this is what Mike Shank translated for me. It says, "Paolo Sarpi, the only unbeliever of his generation." Now that is amazing, that if you were an unbeliever at the end of the 16th century into the early 17th century, you got a statue. My guess is if they gave a statue for every unbeliever in the greater Seattle area, you wouldn't have any freeway space. There would be nowhere to drive. The fact that you would get a statue showed how hard it was to be a non-believer. You would live in kind of notoriety if you didn't believe. This is what it means to kind of live in a secular zero world. It's nearly impossible not to believe. Belief just filters everywhere. And it filters everywhere because for the most part, the very conditions of belief, the liturgy, the way we think about things, the way we talk, all perpetuates belief. And it's really hard for us to even get our minds around what that would be like. What would it be like to live in a secular zero world? The only thought experiment I have for us to think about what it would be like to return to that, at the end of modernity, is a very frightening dystopian TV show that's in the middle of season 4 right now. I don't know, maybe some people didn't show up tonight because they're watching episodes of it, but it's a little show called The Handmaid's Tale. I don't know if anyone's seen The Handmaid's Tale, which is a very kind of scary, really good actually, dystopian TV show. And it's based off these books by Margaret Atwood, who's a Canadian author. And what's happened in these books that have now become these 4 seasons of this TV show is that America has fallen. America's been taken over by a fundamentalist religious group. And America, for the most part, doesn't exist anymore. Now Gilead exists in its place. Actually, if you really watch it, America does exist. It exists as a small enclave, just a small enclave that exists inside Toronto, which, like I said, Margaret Atwood is a Canadian author, which does just feel to me like the ultimate Canadian fantasy, that America no longer exists and it exists as a small enclave inside of Toronto. But God bless Canadians. I think it's a major Canadian fantasy. But America isn't there anymore. Gilead has returned, and they've really they've reimposed this kind of secular zero world where the way you dress, your station in life, your role is connected to how you dress and how you act. It's very hierarchical. But if you see it, one of the most haunting things is that when they meet people, say at the supermarket or just in public transport, you reenact the liturgy. So you see someone and you say, under his eye, or may the Lord open. The idea, of course, is the very kind of structures of belief spill out beyond the religious service. They're everywhere. Belief is perpetuated everywhere. It's really hard not to believe in a secular zero world. So I talk with a lot of denominational officials and seminary people and people who run foundations who are really worried about one of our big why questions of why are people leaving the church? And almost no one who has high anxiety about people leaving the church, no one ever says to me, you know what we need with so many young people leaving or just people being uninterested in the church? You know what we need to get back to? I mean, if we could just get back to something like The Handmaid's Tale, then everything would be okay. Like I've never heard any bishop who says, man, I would love to get back to The Handmaid's Tale. If you just don't want people to leave, you can't leave. If you watch the TV show, you can't leave Gilead. You're kind of stuck in it. So if it's just about retention, then maybe secular zero is the way to go. But no one wants to do that. And actually, it's quite frightening. And Atwood sees it as a dystopian nightmare, because to live in a secular zero world, you have to have three things that we just really don't have anymore. And these three things are, you have to have a deep sense of enchantment, that the world is an enchanted place, that there are devils and demons everywhere, that things themselves, that material things can be imbued with a divine force, and that the self, that our understanding of ourself is porous, that something can get in very easily to the very essence of ourselves. You have to kind of have these three things. And in some ways, those realities hang on with us. I mean, we still find ourselves liking to see horror movies, or we hear good ghost stories when we're drinking with our friends. I mean, we still have some of that hangs on with us. We still have sports memorabilia that loves to glorify great acts done by Tom Brady or somebody. I mean, we still have some of these things. We're never quite as modern as we think we are, but in other ways, these things have dissipated and they don't seem to organize our political systems or our institutional structures. So we do kind of live in a more disenchanted time. And we do have this kind of sense that things themselves aren't imbued with the divine force, and that there's a buffer between us and things outside of us, that it's harder for things to get in. So let me illustrate this by telling you a few stories. There was a huge church controversy that was going on in about the 14th century in England. And I find it a fascinating one, because if there was a kind of summer pastoral theology session in the 14th century, and that was overseen by the Archbishop of Canterbury or something, the biggest issue that they would want to talk about, all of you would have signed up to talk about the biggest issue going on in your congregation. And that issue was that people were taking the host in their mouth, and they weren't swallowing it. So in other words, the priest was putting the host on their tongue, and then they were holding it on their tongue and leaving the cathedral, going out to their fields and putting on their fields, or taking it to a sick pig and feeding it to their sick pig, because the idea of it was that it was enchanted. It was magical. It could do magical things. So this, of course, freaked out the theologians, and it freaked out the priests and the bishops and the archbishops, and they figured they had to do something about this. So they gathered like we're all gathering tonight, and their biggest question wasn't, why are people leaving the church, or why does it feel so hard to be a pastor? Their issue was, how can we get people to swallow the host? And they came up with an incredible technological breakthrough. It's an incredible technological breakthrough. They decided, just make people stick out their tongues, like a 4-year-old who has to go to the doctor's office to check on a sore throat. And now if you've watched gangster movies, there's always that scene in an Irish or Italian gangster movie where there's like a montage of murders. And then at the same time, like the head of the family is taking the Eucharist and sticking out his tongue to show it while bodies are dropping. It's kind of even hung on with us. But the idea, of course, is why they had to do that. It was the sense was that this thing was magical, that it was imbued with a magical force. And so you had to show that you weren't misusing it. As a matter of fact, the theologians really ramped up the anxiety of people and said, well, clearly people need to know that if they misuse this, they could bring judgment on themselves. And so they ramped up that the damnation you could bring on if you misused the Holy Host. And then things completely flipped, where people stopped taking the Eucharist. People were frightened to take the Eucharist. They were scared of what this would mean. As a matter of fact, we have records that it became church law that you had to take communion twice a year. And at least in England, people took it twice a year because they were absolutely frightened of it. They were scared of what to do. It would be similar if you were in a small group in your church this week and someone said to you, hey, I just want you all to know before we're done tonight and stuff, I just want you to know I'm going to have a great week this week because I'm having my appendix out and I love having surgery. It is so cool. I love surgery. I love having something, cut out of my body. It's just so meaningful to me. It's so meaningful to take anesthesia and like go to sleep and maybe never wake up. That is so meaningful to me. If someone said that in your congregation, you would think, this person needs help. Like, what's going on? That is the weirdest thing to think. Well, our ancestors in the faith would think something similar, hearing some of us say, oh, communion's so meaningful to me. I just find it so meaningful. They were frightened by it. They would go to the communion, go to the communion rail with their hands shaking, frightened of what would happen to them. But just like the reason you have surgery, the same reason they would take communion twice a year, because as frightening as it was better than the alternative. And so they took it. But we live a long way away from that kind of anxiety, and maybe in a good way. Maybe that's a really good advance, but we live almost on the far side of that continuum. So I have a 16-year-old son who I love dearly, and I need to state to you publicly how much I love him dearly, because he is the beautiful but true bane of my existence. He has a very strong will, and he has an opinion about everything, and he's a great kid, but he's difficult to deal with. But I won't go into therapy on that right now. But we had before the pandemic, an experience with him. So he's about 15 at the time. And in our church, my wife is a pastor of a PCUSA church. And the way we do communion is she gives words of institution over the elements. And then we're a small enough church, worship about 60 people, that the bread is passed around a circle and then the wine is passed around the circle. And we have this very beautiful moment where we actually share the elements with each other and say each other's name and say, look someone in the eye and say, Sue, this is the body of Christ broken for you. Beautiful moment in our church. Well, this particular Sunday, the elements are going around, the bread is going around, and my son leans over and whispers to me. I'm about 6 o'clock on this circle, and he whispers to me and says, hey, is that bread gluten-free? Now, you need to know that he hates gluten-free. He thinks gluten-free is the worst thing that could ever happen to food because, of course, logically, his mother's gluten-free. So that means it's the worst thing ever. So he asks me, he says, hey, is that bread gluten-free? And I know it's going to be an issue. So I try not to even make eye contact. And I just say, yeah, it's gluten-free. And he leans back over to me and whispers and he says, well, I'm out. And he turns around and walks out of the sanctuary. And I have to confess to you all right now, it took everything in me to not tackle the boy before he got to the narthex and beat him in front of the church. Okay, that's my confession to you. But incredible whiplash of 600 years where people are going to take communion shaking, worried about the damnation before them, and are living in a very enchanted age where things can get inside of them and do something to them. To my 15-year-old son who's like, it's gluten-free. I'm out. I don't need this in my life. I don't like the way it tastes. It's a huge transition and huge shift. And there is this sense, if we're answering the question, why are people leaving? I mean, if you were asking that question in a secular zero world and you were having a church council meeting and saying, we're really worried that young people aren't sticking around our congregational life after confirmation, someone would say a logical question, which is there any way we could buy Peter's teeth? Like if we could get Peter's teeth, then then faith formation would just happen. In many ways in the secular zero world, and obviously you know how this could be abused and was abused, in a secular zero world, faith formation happened by being close to these relics, these enchanted things, this idea that things themselves could be imbued with a divine force. And all of that worked because there was this deep sense that things could get inside you, that things could impact you. One last story, and so I don't get too self-indulgent on these stories, but there's a really great story from the 4th century with Augustine. So Augustine got sick, and his beloved mother, Monica, was worried about him. He was about 8 or 9, and he got the flu. And the story goes that she was so worried about him that she took him and she stripped him down naked, and then she got him wet, just nice and damp. And then she took him and rolled him in salt. The idea being that he was sick and he was vulnerable to evil forces getting in him, because he was sick. But if he was wrapped in salt, that would repel the demons. So my very bad dad joke is, well, it's clear that demons are more into sweet things than savory things. And you roll your eyes and think a lot less of me right now. But that's actually part of my pedagogical point, that I can only see a few of you, but no one started sweating or no one pushed themselves back from their computer like, oh my gosh, this guy through some magical digital space just insulted demons and has made us all vulnerable to this. I mean, it's actually quite hard for me to think I could say a bad joke and a demon or a devil could put a vendetta on my head. Though that was quite a common thing you might assume in a secular zero world, but that's a really hard thing for us to get our minds around. I feel a little bit like there's a buffer between me and the world. When my kids start acting up, I don't think, oh my gosh, something evil has got into the essence of their being. I think, oh, they're hungry, or they had a sleepover and didn't get enough sleep. There's a buffer from the essence. Closest thing we have to this kind of porous sense, or maybe a way to see this buffer, is to show you one of the classic commercials of all time, a Snickers commercial. And so you see it here in this classic Snickers commercial. Kendall, I'm going to play this and give me a thumbs up if you can hear it.
Mike, what is your deal, man?
Oh, come on, man. You've been riding me all day.
Mike, you're playing like Betty White out there.
That's not what your girlfriend said.
Baby! Eat a Snickers. Better?
Better.
How about that?
That hurt.
You're not you when you're hungry. Snickers satisfies.
All right, so you hear it and you can kind of see the buffer that when you're even not you, it's not that the essence of your being has been changed or some evil force or even some holy force has gotten in and transformed you. It's you're not you and you're hungry. It's just that you're hungry. It's just the constitution of your physical being, and it's you're hungry or had too much to drink or didn't sleep. So this is a very different kind of way of thinking. So back to our two why questions. Why does it feel so hard to be a pastor? Well, I don't want to belittle people 16, in the 14th or 15th century or something, or in the 13th century. I'm sure it was hard to be a pastor, but there was significance in this. When you're in an enchanted age where things are imbued with a divine force and the self is porous, the pastor has an incredible role, particularly in this time. The priest has a significant role. And like I said, people couldn't leave. But this is where we start to enter closer into our own time, and we start to have the secular dawn, and we enter into what we might call secular one. So before, when we saw that the profane and the sacred and the profane kind of fit together like a puzzle, now we do find in the secular one world that there's tension between these, and there's a particular tension between the public and the private. We could even say the secular arrives. It has its first kind of arrival, its DNA, its building blocks come in this dividing out of public and private. And think about this, because like I said, when one of these starts to arrive, when none of these forms of the secular arrive, it stays with us. It remains kind of lodged in our social consciousness. And so this still hangs on with us. I mean, we still tend to think, even though we violate these rules all the time, we tend to think that there are at least 4 things that polite people don't talk about, say at a dinner party. Like in a public space, there are some things that polite people don't talk about. For instance, you shouldn't talk about politics at a dinner party. You know, if you go to PLU and you're at a dinner party with donors and professors and administrators, you probably shouldn't talk about politics at a dinner party. It's not polite. I mean, it's nearly impossible in our cultural context not to now, but you shouldn't do that. You also shouldn't talk about money. I mean, that's very rude to ask someone how much money they make or something. You don't do that. The third thing you don't do, which I think we probably still all agree at a dinner party where you don't know many people and you want to be polite, you shouldn't talk about sex. Like that is completely out of bounds. And then of course, the fourth thing that's out of bounds is religion, that you shouldn't talk to people about religion. Maybe at PLU you could do that because of its religious heritage, but if you were meeting with the mayor or something of your town, you shouldn't probably at a dinner party talk about religion. And the reason that even holds on with us is because we imagine that those 4 things, and particularly for our interest, it's really interesting that religion is there, that we make the assumption that those are private realities, and polite people don't ask about private things in the public realm. You shouldn't do that. And so what happens when the secular arrives is that belief and participation in religious community starts to get filed under a private reality. It starts to move to a private thing. It starts to take this move towards being a more individual thing, but at least becomes a more private thing, something embedded even in your own will. So we do have these things replaced. Instead of enchantment and things being imbued with the divine force and the self being porous, we have the arrival of wills being really significant. Now what happens in this kind of a secular age is it's important that particularly individuals, but maybe even a community, but particularly individuals have to willfully decide to participate. Will religion mean anything in your life? Will being part of a faith community be important to you? Will, say, being Lutheran or Presbyterian mean anything to you as you're a young adult? Well, it will only matter if you willfully decide to enact your life now that way. So now there needs to be this need to help people make this decision to connect, where before it was the idea was that if you just got people close to the holy things, the things that were imbued with the divine force, that would be enough. But now somehow, being a pastor, you have to get inside of people's mechanisms of decision and interest and help them start to make the decision to enact their lives this way. So to illustrate this, let me show you another video clip. And this comes from the PBS NewsHour, which I show you all so you think I'm sophisticated and watch PBS. But it comes from right after Notre Dame was tragically set ablaze. And you're going to hear a woman talking who is the dean of the American Cathedral. You'll see it listed there. And listen to how she talks. Now, I'm showing you this not to critique her. I actually would answer the exact same way that she answers. But you'll see a very, very big difference in how she responds than, say, how someone in a secular zero world would respond. So listen to what she says.
Led is Dean of the American Cathedral in Paris.
It's brought out in all of us how much we care, not just about the building, which is gorgeous and historic, but about what it stands for. Paris, France, Europe, the world, tradition, Christian faith at its finest. Christian faith that endures.
The Dean is grateful that so many relics survived.
The relics are important, whether or not it really was Jesus's crown of thorns, for instance. Who knows? What's important is that it was a focus of faith, a focus of people's prayers for hundreds of years. So the things themselves are not so important as what they stand for, what they mean to people, the faith they evoke.
At present, the precise...
All right, so you hear it. And like I said, I would answer the exact same way she did, but it's very different. She says, well, it doesn't really matter if those really were Jesus' crown of thorns or not. That's not what's important. What's important is that people willfully decided that those were important and prayed to those. What mattered is that it was a tool, a device that helped people make decisions to believe or help them into certain practices of the faith. So there is this huge transition where the will becomes very important. We see another transition at this time that affects us greatly and brings us deeper into a secular age, is that we move from living in a cosmos to living in a universe. So when you live in a cosmos, even the natural phenomena of the world, almost everything, even in the created realm, speaks. It has something to say to you. It is directing you. Where when you live in a universe, we don't tend to think even natural phenomena speak to us. So for instance, you all, those of you who are pastoring churches right now, all remember this date very well, which was January 31st, 2018. You remember this, right? Like some of you are still kind of just, haven't recovered from this date. Now I get it. I can't see all your faces, and this would be better if we were in a room together, but a lot of you are racing to think back to, do I remember this? I don't remember this date. You don't remember this at all, but this was a pretty interesting date. This was the time of the super blood moon or super blue moon, or this super moon that came about. And you don't remember this, but again, if you were in a secular zero world, you would have remembered it. And my joke to you is that you remember it because your daytimer was just filled with pastoral care appointments. Of course it was, that everyone was calling and saying, Pastor, we're thinking about having a baby, but now there's this super blood moon. Should we do it or should we not? I mean, what is God trying to communicate to us? Or some of you are saying, I was supposed to be on a flight tomorrow, but now there's a super red blood moon. I'm not sure if I should do it. Or I was going to take a different job. Should I do that? I don't know. This is frightening. Your daytimer should have been filled with that, but it wasn't. No one seemed to care, or it became a really cool Instagram moment, but that was about as far as it went. But if you were living in a different time, there would be this idea when you're you're living inside of a cosmos as opposed to the universe, there's a sense that this means something, that this is communicating something, that there's something larger that the world and its history is being drawn towards because of this phenomenon, this natural phenomenon. But now we kind of know, well, we know exactly what this is. This is a mathematical reality. We know we can even pretty much date to the day when this will happen again every 100 and some years, that we live in a very different kind of sense of the world. To illustrate this, and maybe I'm showing you too many video clips, but I figure it's towards the end of your day and you can never have too much TV. So let me show you a clip from Jimmy Kimmel Live that gets at this, which I think is interesting.
Well, it was a strange and mystical day in the universe. Last night, lasting into early this morning, we had a blue moon, a blood moon, a supermoon, and a full lunar eclipse all at the same time. The moon pulled out all the stops to try to get us to look up from our phones. This is something I've been excited about this for a few days. I read about it, and then I marked it in my calendar. I told my wife, I was like, we got to get it. I wrote super blood blue moon, 5:29 a.m. That was supposed to be the ideal time. And this hasn't happened for 152 years. It's a rare thing, so I wanted to get up to see it. So I set my alarm for 5:25, giving me 4 minutes to get up and get out on the balcony. Alarm went on. I turn it off. I get up. I go to the bathroom. And then I come out of the bathroom, I get right back into bed and go to sleep. I forgot about it immediately. I really, like, in between the time I was in the bathroom, it totally left my mind. And I have to say, I'm actually kind of glad I didn't see it, because the moon, if you think about it, the moon is a little bit of a show-off. Every month, it's another thing we have to watch. You don't see the sun pulling this kind of crap. The sun just hangs out. I'm up, I'm down, I'll see you tomorrow. The moon's like, look at me, put on your safety glasses. I'm blocking the sun, everybody. Interestingly, in ancient times, they believed that the confluence of a blood moon and a lunar eclipse meant that a terrible leader had risen up to torment his people. Did you see the State of the Union last night? President Trump delivered his first State of the Union address.
All right, so maybe a cheap shot by Jimmy there, but you see the point. First of all, that he can wake up and easily forget about it, that he's not haunted by what does this actually mean. And then, of course, the idea in an earlier time is, of course, this could mean something. But in this kind of secular age that we now inherit, it doesn't necessarily point to that. So this is different for the pastor. Now the pastor has to somehow impact people's wills and get them to willfully decide to participate. And the pastor doesn't necessarily get to say what natural phenomenon even mean anymore. Like I said, there weren't people filling up your daytime or trying to help them understand what this phenomenon means. Doesn't mean they don't want you to help them understand what some other things mean, but those become disconnected from even some of the kind of natural realities. But there becomes a big challenge in this kind of secular age when it arrives in secular one. This does become the time of the denomination, because it now becomes possible that people could leave, that if people don't willfully decide to be part of this, they could go. And the pastor, why is it so hard? You have to somehow get people who have all sorts of other choices to willfully decide to participate in this, to enact their life this way. So we often feel this way with our young people. It's one of the reasons why in the ELCA, there's the youth gathering. And I'm going to throw a little shade on the youth gathering, but I don't mean to. I'm a fan of the youth gathering, but it's a legitimate struggle that every denomination, this is true for, that it can only exist for one more generation. Every modern denomination can only exist for one more generation. What I mean by that is if the next generation does not willfully decide to enact their lives inside of that denomination won't exist. So if the next generation of young people do not decide to see themselves as they grow as ELCA Lutherans, the ELCA can't exist. So you do get, amongst all the cuts within the ELCA, one thing that doesn't get cut as much is the youth gathering. And the youth gathering is there. And this is my shade throwing on it. I think it's a good thing. I'll reiterate that. But it is really important that you have a bunch of young people who can go to a big dome event and look around and think, wow, there are a lot of Lutherans here, and maybe I could be a Lutheran someday. Maybe it's legitimate. I don't think it's quite that explicit. It's more tacit, but that becomes a big piece of it. If they don't, if they don't willfully decide to do that, it can't exist for the next generation. And so really, that's what it becomes for. So I was at one a few years ago, and it was like right in the middle of it, and it was a great event. kids were having a great time. The adults were having a great time. But we were in a transition time, and I found myself in a kind of clogged up with a bunch of people trying to get through a hallway. And there were these two high school girls in front of me. I don't know, they maybe were juniors in high school. And I happened just to be behind them so I could kind of eavesdrop on them. I didn't mean to eavesdrop on them, but I could overhear what they were saying. And they were walking together, and they were clearly really good friends. And they were kind of walking side by side. And one did that thing where you kick your friend, like you kind of lift your ankle and kick the person next to you, and they don't know where it's coming from. It'd be much easier for me to do it if I was standing in front of you right now, though I might pull a muscle. But she kicked her friend next to her, and her friend immediately knew it was her. And it was all done in fun and playfulness. And so the girl that got kicked turned to the girl who kicked her, and she said, "Oh my gosh." I think they're from California. That's how in my memory I remember it. She said, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe you just kicked me." And they kind of looked at each other and laughed. And then the girl who got kicked said this. I was shocked by it. She said, "I can't believe you just kicked me. That is such an un-Lutheran thing to do." And I was just taken back with the un-Lutheran thing. And that they kept racing in my mind. The un-Lutheran thing to do. She kicked her friend playfully. Un-Lutheran thing. I thought if the girl would have turned to her and said, "Hey, I just want you to know, we're hearing all this stuff about justification by faith alone, but I want you to know our works really are important." Now that would have been an un-Lutheran thing to do, but just kicking her, that wasn't an un-Lutheran thing to do. She didn't say that's an un-Christian thing to do, or that's an unethical thing to do. She said that's an un-Lutheran thing to do, which shows she got exactly why over $1 million is spent on that event, because she got the very point of it. She was spending a week inside of imagining, more tacitly than explicitly again, imagining what it would be to be a Lutheran as she grows up, to willfully decide to live this out as she grows. And maybe it was money well spent, but this becomes a very different kind of phenomenon. And it now becomes a big challenge for the pastor to help people enact this way of life. And it also means that it's now quite possible that people could decide not to be part of a church. They could decide just to leave. So this wills and living in a cosmos as opposed to a universe, however, is people don't do it. I think maybe these words are being cut off with my window of looking at your faces, but it often doesn't still happen. And when you think about this historically, because there still is a deep sense of duty and loyalty that holds this together. So people may be willfully deciding, and they may live in a cosmos instead of a universe, but nevertheless, there's still a deeper sense to a kind of communal duty. However, as this unfolds, that starts to disappear as well, which takes us then into what we might call secular too. And I would guess if we were doing that chat, give your definition of what the secular is, almost all of you probably would have given, maybe not knowing, given a secular two definition. We could define secular two. If secular one is now there's this divide between the public and private, then secular two is that fewer and fewer people are going to church. It's the loss of participation actually in religious communities. And this is almost always how we talk about secular. For instance, we do have this moment that we just got empirical verification of, that America, for the first time, and the first time in all of Pew Research, has fewer people are reporting to be going to church than any other time in America. Like it just flipped to 49 or 47% in the last couple months, or at least it was studied and showed in the last couple months. And usually that's how we think about secular, is that fewer and fewer people are going to church. So it radicalizes this public-private divide. And now we feel like there's almost a competition, a deep competition between religious spaces and a-religious places. Like what we'll talk about next week is, why does it feel like everything is more important than church? Why is AAU basketball something that parents always choose over confirmation? What's going on culturally for that to happen? And that's usually how we kind of think about the secular, that the church is losing out to these other commitments and these other activities, and fewer people are interested in coming to church. This is almost how we always think about it. And it puts an incredible amount of pressure on the pastor. The pastor somehow has to find a way to keep market share, to be really crass, in the midst of this, that the secular too is losing. And so how do we actually we tend to even define what faith is around secular two frames, that we allow sociologists to define what faith is. And we think, well, how can we keep people committed? How can we keep people connected? How can they have a faith that they keep coming week by week? Now, what I want us to see here is that there is reason, and especially if you're leading a congregation, there's a reason we feel that anxiety of secular too. And there's just no doubt that we're in the midst of decline, like the research has just shown. But I'm not so sure this is our deepest issue. I think that this actually often is a red herring that gets us, that moves us from actually seeing the deeper issue here. But we tend to feel that way, and it can do some kind of diabolical stuff to us if we define our issue as a secular two issue, that fewer and fewer people are going to church and we need to find a way to win more and more people back. For instance, it starts to take on certain logics. So I had a friend who told me, he was a pastor, he said that he did a terrible mistake that I would not recommend to any of you, is that he Googled his church. Like he just Googled it, and then he saw that there were like 5 Google reviews of his church. You should never Google yourself or Google your church. It's a very dangerous thing. But worse, and he did the worst thing, is you should not read those reviews of your church if they're there. And he read them, and he was ready for an existential crisis. He was ready to be crying in the corner for the night, but he was actually happy. He's like, they were all 4.5 or 5 stars. I mean, he felt, I'm doing pretty good. So he read these things, and then he's like, oh, this is we're doing all right. Except then it hit him, and he started to become very uncomfortable because he noticed that all of the 5 reviews were basically written just like you would write a review of an Airbnb. Like it said about his church, like, oh, we love this church. Carpets are always clean. The great children's programming, parking is super easy at this church. Like everything became about the amenities of the church. And this becomes part of the trap. If we start to define our issue as a secular two issue, then the best churches and the best pastors are those that can produce the most amenities, that can have the most amenities to attract and keep the most people. And we do really become resource obsessed. The best churches are the churches with the most resources. Those are the ones that can do the best. Those are the ones that will survive. And I do think that that's a deep temptation. And I don't really think it's the deep issue. I don't think that's really what it means to live in a secular age. And I don't necessarily think people are leaving just because we don't have enough amenities for them. And I don't think what makes being a pastor difficult is that you just have to somehow get your Google reviews up, or, maybe it's not Google reviews, but you just have to get more amenities. I think we feel that. And if you're overseeing a budget, you feel that. And I don't want to be too naive about this. I mean, I teach at Luther Seminary. I'm very aware that if the denomination loses another, I don't know what it is, 6, 7, 8% of people who are affiliate with the ELCA, it will have huge ramifications for seminary. So this is a issue. And if you are a quote unquote religious professional, this has huge ramifications. But I think what makes being a pastor so difficult, or why people are leaving, is not necessarily secular too, though this gets all the headlines. And this is often when you look across your synod and think, oh, I'm just not doing well as a pastor. You often say, well, that person, this is more intuitive again. You think that person is doing much better in a kind of secular two reality. But I think our issue, and really what the answer to our why questions are, is that it's secular 3. So if secular 1 is this divide between the public and private, and secular 2 is that fewer and fewer people are going to church, and there becomes a kind of conflict between religious and a-religious spaces, secular 3 is different. When we live inside a secular 3 age, or we define the kind of society, the kind of age we're in as a secular one, we could define it as a time when, an experience where all belief becomes contested. Or maybe a better way to say it is that all belief becomes fragilized. We all inherit a kind of fragile belief. And so this has both a positive and a kind of negative to it. And I don't want you to think necessarily of those as pejorative, but maybe think of them like a battery, where there's a kind of positive charge and then there's a necessity of the negative to allow that battery to work. Well, in the secular 3 age, there is this negative. And the negative of the secular 3 age is that it is the loss of transcendence as an overarching meaning system. It becomes harder and harder for people to feel it logical or captivating to their imagination or necessary that there is a living God who speaks to them, that there's a living God with a word that is directing the world in their lives. Even when they want that, that feels, can I believe that? or they can forget it, or it can fade into the background. So the negative element is just belief in a sense of a personal living God, even if you rationally believe it, easily gets pushed into the background. And we live in an odd time where people can go months, weeks, pastors can go months or weeks without really thinking about God, which in a secular zero world was not possible in any way for anyone. You were always thinking about these divine realities. But there's also a positive reality to this. And the positive reality, while there's a loss of transcendence as an overarching meaning system, there's also this deep yearning for meaning, that people deeply want a sense of meaning, and they're on a journey to find meaning, that people are looking for a kind of deep sense of meaning. So what we could say then is that this kind of secular age that we're in has a kind of two-way fragilization, if you will. It's a kind of two-way fragilization. And what I mean by that is, in this kind of secular age, the kind of people that you're ministering to in your pastoring, that they are people who, if they believe, cannot help at times doubting. They just can't. Any of us, even those of us who have been ordained for 20 years, can't help having those moments where we think, yeah, no, I believe this. Yeah, no, I've given my whole life to this. I believe this. And then you have those thoughts pop up where you think, if I would have been born in another place in the world, would I believe this? I mean, if I wasn't born into the family I was born in, would I really believe this? Or you think, no, I believe this. I totally believe this. And then you get struck again and you think, well, I mean, is this true? I mean, I've given my life to it, but is this true, or is this just an evolutionary trick? I mean, maybe all religion is false pattern recognition. You can't help but find yourself fragilized at sometimes. The thinker that I'm drawing from this, well, I'll share a few quotes for in a minute, is Charles Taylor. And Taylor's basic point is everyone who's a believer feels that. The way I would add to it is there's only a small percentage of people who don't. And those small percentage of people who believe without ever doubting in our society are called religious fundamentalists. But all the rest of us are coming in and out of doubt at one time or another. But what's fascinating about Taylor, this Canadian philosopher's work that I'm drawing on, is he wants to say it's a two-way fragilization. So he says it also works the other way. Let's say you live in Austin, Texas, you're working on an app, you're in a band, you move there after college, and gosh, you know what religion is. I mean, come on. Anyone who believes in anything that has to do with religion or faith, I mean, it's just a crutch for people. That's all faith is. And all religious systems are ways of powerful people keeping other people down. That's all it is. And you know what happens when you die? I mean, come on, let's just be honest. When you die, it's like unplugging a TV set. It just goes dark. It's just nothing. When you're dead, there's nothing there. That's all there is. That's what you believe. Your belief system is that you don't believe anything. Taylor's point is, at some point, you'll find that belief system of unbelief fragilized. For instance, you'll go to your nephew's Bach concert one Christmas season. You'll have had a couple drinks after work, and you'll just go because you're trying to be a good uncle, but you'll sit in the back of that sanctuary and you'll hear that music and you'll find something calling out to you. And you'll find that your unbelief becomes fragilized. You'll find for a moment that even though you don't believe, you find yourself believing. Or you'll have your first child and you'll be like, there's no meaning in the universe, man. If anyone who has to impose meaning on the universe is they're just weak-minded. Like, face the fact that there's no meaning here. And then you'll hold your baby for the first time and you'll have something reach for you and you'll think, oh my gosh, maybe there's something more going on here. So there becomes this kind of two-way fragilization as this plays out. There then is only a small percentage of people who are unbelievers who never find themselves once in a while believing. And those people we call British New Atheists. But everyone else at one point or another, even if they don't believe, finds themselves believing. So this leads us into what I think is our real problematic, or the struggle people have and what they wrestle with that maybe leads them out of the church, or what makes it so hard to be a pastor. It's that we inherit what we might call an immanent frame, that we live inside the kind of default setting of our imagination is not a supernatural one, but it's a natural one. It's not a transcendent one, but it's an immanent one. So here's Charles Taylor talking about this immanent frame. He says the immanent frame is a constructed social space that frames our lives entirely within a natural rather than a supernatural order. It's a circumscribed space of the modern social imaginary that precludes transcendence. So what he's saying is that us late modern human beings are like your cell phone when it's taken right out of the package. It's set with default settings. And our default settings are more immanent than they're transcendent. that we live more inside of an immanent frame than having a deep sense that there is a living, speaking God who's calling out to us. If that becomes much harder for people, then what's so difficult about being a pastor in this kind of secular age is that we have to do ministry inside of this immanent frame. We have to do it inside where it's really hard for people to understand how this is so. How do we testify to a living God where it becomes so hard for people inside of their default setting being set towards immanence as opposed to transcendence? Now, the way for me to make sense of the world is to show you pop culture references, as you've already seen. So let me show you this immanent frame, because this is philosopher talk. So let's get our feet a little bit more on the ground, and let me just show you some lyrics from a British pop star that maybe illustrates better what this immanent frame is and why I think this becomes the real challenge for the pastor. And really maybe the reason that people are leaving the church is because they can't find a way of believing inside the immanent frame. And so this comes from Lily Allen, the British pop star, and she had a song. It's an old song, so it seems cool to reference a British pop star, but this is from quite a while ago, but it illustrates this point perfectly. So in the song, The Fear, she has this lyric, and you can get the kind of sense of this, of the way she kind of performs this. It's very in your face. It's very irreverent for all intents and purposes. It's middle finger waving in your face. But here is one of the verses. She says, life's about film stars and less about mothers, but it doesn't matter because I'm packing plastic. And that's what makes my life so effing fantastic. Now it is, too late in this presentation to try to exegete pop stars lyrics. That is a dangerous game to play. So I really don't quite know what she means by this. I don't know what packing plastic means. It probably means she has a credit card with a large credit limit on it, or more likely it means she's had a part of her body enhanced, and that's what makes her life so fantastic. That becomes the measure of the good life. So you get this sense of this kind of irreverence, middle finger in your face. But this is where the immanent frame comes in. In the next line, she says, now I'm a weapon of massive consumption. It's not my fault. It's how I'm programmed to function. Now here it is. Now I'm not a saint, but I'm not a sinner. Now everything's cool as long as I'm getting thinner. Now this is the immanent frame. Taylor's point is, for most of human history, what kept people up at night? As a matter of fact, our patron saint, Martin Luther, what kept him up at night is he a saint or is he a sinner? What does God think of him? He can't sleep. Anxiety overwhelming. What does God think? What is saint or sinner? Where am I? What am I eternally destined for? Heaven or hell? And of course, Luther's profound theological breakthrough in the midst of the early dawning of modernity is to say you're not either or. It's not one or the other. You're both simultaneously. But for most of human history, particularly in the West, this was a live question. Are you a saint or a sinner? And this is a question that's framed by a more transcendent framework than an immanent one. But now, that's a huge perspective all the way up until Lily Allen writes the song in 2012. Okay, we're not going to give her that much credit, but she does echo something that's true within our cultural context, that all of a sudden she just says, saint or sinner, heaven or hell, I don't care. I mean, those things don't keep me up at night. Those things don't keep me up at night at all. Now, what's fascinating is she admits there's something that does keep her up at night. It's not that somehow she's thrown off God and therefore she's free and never has to face anxiety or fear. She feels deep, acute senses of anxiety and guilt. It's just not based in a kind of transcendent referent. It's not based in the law or in God's act or the Holy Scriptures. No. What she feels like she lives under the anxiety of is something completely imminent. Swimsuit season's coming. And what are people going to think of her? What keeps her out at night and tossing and turning and wondering is not Luther's question, am I a saint or a sinner? It is, what do people think of my body? And so this becomes a very different way of making meaning in our kind of cultural situation. And you see how it becomes this more imminent reality. So Taylor says this, he says, we can't help looking over our shoulders from time to time, looking sideways, living our faith in a condition of doubt and uncertainty. This becomes the environment in which we do ministry, I think, is inside this secular 3 reality. And part of the devastating reality, part of the rut we get stuck in is we often think of it as a secular 2 reality. How can we get more and more people to come? But the more we do that, the more we actually impose more imminent realities on people. The more we make the issue not how do you help people, how do you pastor people so that they might learn to pray, So how they might learn to have an encounter with God. So they might learn what it means to confess and find forgiveness. We start to think, well, how could we get a gym? Or, my sermon should be funnier. How do we get people not to drive by our church when they go to the church down the street, but how do we get them to pull in? And that actually just imposes more this kind of imminent spin on this. So what I should do now as we move forward, and you kind of see this sense of doubt. Taylor's point is we all kind of get crossed up and we have to deal with this. And even Lily Allen does. She has this lyric. So those were her verses. I'm a weapon of massive consumption, and I'm not saying I'm a sinner, but everything's cool as long as I'm getting thinner. But this is the chorus, and the chorus says, I don't know what's right or what's real anymore. I don't know how I'm meant to feel anymore. When do you think it all becomes clear? Because I'm being overtaken by the fear. So even Lily Allen, deeply in this irreverent middle finger in your face song, has a deep longing question of, is there something greater here? Is there a way to be connected to something more and something more full that pulls me into a deeper way of life? Now, what I should do right now is play the song for you. And we should do that. But unfortunately, that would be too obvious. So I want to play you another song. And so I'm going to play the song for you, and you'll see the lyrics come up. And what I want you to do, I guess I really want to apologize for this song. Not really because there's anything inappropriate in it, but because this is a song by a band called Purple Mountains. And I'm sure, I don't know if you've heard of it. You're way cooler than me if you've heard of this singer-songwriter before. But this is a song called Margaritas at the Mall. And I think it encompasses this secular 3 age really well. So I want you to listen to it and see what lyric really sticks out to you. But I have to apologize. And what I have to apologize for is not that there's anything inappropriate in it. I mean, there's one line that's a little inappropriate, but that's fun on a Tuesday night. What I need to apologize for is that this song, and this songwriter sounds a little bit like Johnny Cash, and this tune is going to get stuck in your head. Like, it is going to get stuck so deep in your head that you're going to wake up at 3 a.m. and you're going to be humming this, and you are going to curse my name. So, and you're going to be humming this next Tuesday when we meet on this Zoom conversation. So what I want you to do, we're going to turn this spiritual. And what I want you to do is, when you find this song caught in your head, I want you to pray. I want you to take that occasion to pray. And I want you to pray, God, are you telling me right now to go onto Amazon and buy an Andy Root book? All right, that's what I want you to do. All right, I'm kidding. All right, so listen to this song. You'll see the lyrics kind of come up, and we'll use this to kind of jump our way into breakout rooms, to give you a break and then jump out in breakout rooms before we can then have some Q&A conversation. So listen to the song and just make note of what lyric jumps out to you. And then when we go out into breakout rooms, we'll start in breakout rooms by talking about what lyric kind of jumped out to us, and then what other connections you're making throughout the whole of the conversation we've had tonight. So here it is, Purple Mountains, Margaritas at the Mall.
Just drinking margaritas at the mall. That's what this stuff adds up to after all. Magenta, orange, acid green, peacock blue and burgundy. Drinking margaritas
All right, so it gets stuck in your head, I think, probably, maybe, but there's some profound lines on it. And I think this becomes the real challenge, why being a pastor is so hard, is because you're trotting the sod of the visible, where people aren't sure they need a new word from God, or you're inheriting a whole culture that's been built in a society that's been built without needing a new word for God. And this is not somebody who is writing the song who's a believer. This is actually somebody who's writing a song who doesn't believe. And it's actually quite a tragic tale. If you read the Wikipedia, the songwriter, about 2 years ago, he killed himself, which is a horrific reality. But he does ask a profound question. How long can the world go on with no new word from God? And the kind of late modern society that we're living in, the kind of secular age we have, is one that's been constructed without a need for a word from God. And yet your job every Sunday is to bring the word of God. And that becomes a deep challenge. And yet, as this songwriter deeply says, people are yearning for meaning, yearning significantly in his own life, testifies to yearning deeply to be pointed to something bigger. Or is all church about is margaritas at the mall. So have your church and your ministry look like the mall, and it's all this stuff adds up to after all. It's I think a profound reality.